Right, good morning everyone. Our study is entitled The Association Between Arterial Oxygen Tension, Haemoglobin Concentration and Mortality in Mechanically Ventilated Critically Ill Patients. We don't have any conflicts of interest or funding sources to declare. I'd like to acknowledge Dave Pilcher's help and his guidance with this work. We know that both hypoxemia and anemia are common findings in ICU patients. And we know that both have been associated with significant increases in morbidity and mortality. This is a graph from a study in cardiac surgical ICU patients that demonstrates increasing odds of death with declining hemoglobin. This sort of relationship has been demonstrated in other intensive care populations as well. This is a study from the core APD group that shows increasing odds of death with increasing hypoxemia. However, we also know that treating anemia with transfusions and possibly also hypoxemia with oxygen supplementation can also be harmful. This is a large European cohort study that showed increasing odds of death for transfused patients after adjustment for various risk factors. This here is the Kaplan-Meier curve from the famous TRIC study, again showing higher mortality amongst liberally transfused patients. Due to these observations, we've seen a trend towards restrictive use of blood products and even oxygen in critical care settings over the last decade or two, despite the known harmful effects of both hypoxemia and anemia. This is a recent study demonstrating a trend towards lower mortality with lower oxygenation targets. So from this sort of brief snapshot of the literature, we can see that the effects of both oxygenation and hemoglobin has been extensively studied. However, the interaction between the two and their combined effect on mortality has not specifically been studied. Hence, we arrive at our hypothesis that amongst critically ill, mechanically ventilated patients admitted to Australia and New Zealand ICUs, hemoglobin level will modify the association between oxygenation and mortality. More specifically, the presence of lower hemoglobin levels would increase the independent risk of death with increasing hypoxemia. We did a retrospective cohort study using data from the ANZICS core adult patient database. Data access was approved by the core directorate and ethics approval was secured from the relevant authority. We included adult patients aged over 16 who were mechanically ventilated and admitted to ICU between January 2006 and December 2015. We excluded readmission episodes, cardiac surgical patients, and patients with missing data for oxygenation, hemoglobin, and vital status at hospital discharge. FiO2 and PaO2 were sourced from the blood gas that was used in the Apache 3 scoring algorithm, and the highest and lowest hemoglobin levels in the first 24 hours were both available and both used. These were the variables that we extracted. I won't dwell on this for the interest of time. All statistical analyses were performed in Starter 13.0 and Anaconda using the Python language. PaO2 FiO2 ratios, or PF ratios, were calculated, and both PaO2 and PF ratios were divided into deciles for the analysis. Hemoglobin, both the lowest and the highest in the first 24 hours, were divided into two groups by doing a median split. Odds ratios with 95% confidence intervals were used as the primary outcome, odds ratio for hospital mortality, that is. And we used a p-value of 0.001 as our threshold of significance during the regression analysis to basically reduce the likelihood of detecting clinically meaningless results. We used a hierarchical logistic regression model with patients nested within sites and sites treated as random effects. We created separate models using both PaO2 and PF ratio as the index of oxygenation, and then we stratified by hemoglobin, both highest and lowest, to yield 4 final models. I'll show some graphs that make this a little bit clearer. We tested for effect modification using hemoglobin-oxygen interaction terms, and discrimination was tested using the C statistic. These were the confounders that we adjusted for in the multivariate model. Site, as I've already said, Apache 3 score with oxygenation component removed, Apache 3 diagnostic group, gender, because there was a very significant difference in hemoglobin between the genders, elective status, admission year, which we put into model as a continuous variable once the linearity of the relationship was confirmed, relationship with mortality, and FiO2 in the PaO2 models. So let's have a look at the results. We had 1,196,089 patients that were available in the data set. Out of these, nearly 250,000 were not mechanically ventilated, so they were removed. And then there were readmission episodes and cardiac admissions, surgical admissions that accounted for another 170,000 odd patients. There were then 74,000 patients excluded from missing data that left us with a total of 219,723 patients for analysis. Out of these, 33,395 died in ICU and a total of 45,348 died in hospital. This is a truncated patient characteristics table that I'm going to skip over for sake of brevity, but if people want me to come back to it at the end, I'd be happy to. These are the graphs of mortality by PaO2 and PF ratio. These are relationships that have been established quite clearly in the literature, and we did this just to confirm. When we stratify the PaO2 mortality curve, so that's the curve on the left here, when we stratify that by hemoglobin, so we'll just have a look at hemoglobin lowest in the first instance, we get this graph. So I'll take you through this in a little bit more detail. On the x-axis here, we have the PaO2 deciles. On the y-axis, we have odds ratio of mortality. We set the PaO2 group 88 to 102 as the reference group, so that's got the odds ratio of 1 there. The solid orange and solid blue lines are the two hemoglobin groups. The blue group has a mean hemoglobin of 89, so this is the lowest hemoglobin in the first 24 hours. And the orange group has a mean hemoglobin of 126. The light blue and light orange lines are the 95% confidence intervals. What we see in the right side of this graph is that there is quite a lot of overlap between the confidence intervals, indicating that there is no difference in mortality between the hemoglobin strata in this region. However, from a PaO2 value of 102 down, so that's these 4 deciles here, we can see that there's very clear separation of the two curves, demonstrating higher mortality with lower PaO2 in the lower hemoglobin group, the blue curve. When we repeat this with the highest hemoglobin available in the first 24 hours, the graph looks almost identical. The only difference here is that the hemoglobin values for the blue and orange lines are different. So this group has a mean hemoglobin of 101 and this group 137. As I said before, these groups were just split by the median, so there's roughly half, so roughly 110,000 in the top group and 110,000 in the bottom group. When we do this by PF ratio, once again the curve looks exactly the same. The separation point here again is at the 4th decile at a PF ratio of around 210. When we do this, so this is for the lowest hemoglobin. When we do this by highest hemoglobin, once again it looks the same. So what we can see from these 4 graphs is that at PaO2 values greater than 102 or PF ratio greater than 210, there's no differential impact of hemoglobin stratification on the association between oxygenation and mortality. However, at values less than these, there is a very clear independent effect of hemoglobin on mortality, regardless of which oxidation index or which hemoglobin value is used. When we test this formally using hemoglobin-oxygen interaction terms, we found strong evidence for this for effect modification, with p-values lower than 0.001 for all 4 models. The C-statistics ranged from 0.8338 to 0.8341 for the 4 models. Therefore, in critically ill mechanically ventilated patients treated in our ICUs, we've shown that hemoglobin level modifies the association between oxygen and mortality, regardless of the index of oxygenation that's used. Specifically, lower hemoglobin independently increases the risk of death in hypoxemic but not non-hypoxemic patients. I did want to go through effect modifiers in a bit more detail, but I think in the interest of time I might skip it, except to say that effect modification essentially occurs when the magnitude of effect, so that's the association between an exposure and an outcome, differs based on the value of a third variable. So in our case, that's hemoglobin. The strengths of this study are that it utilizes a large cohort of mechanically ventilated patients that represents our practice. It's a well-known database that's extensively been used for research, and hospital mortality is a definitive and widely used endpoint in critical care. The weaknesses obviously are that it's a retrospective observational study and can only detect associations, and there are significant data limitations that I've mentioned there, and most importantly, there's no treatment data available. So I'll just skip through this. There's some future work that we've planned, and we'd just like to conclude that haemoglobin is an effect modifier on the association between hypoxemia and mortality. Thank you.
Do you have a particular haemoglobin threshold in mind, I guess is the question. If I've got a hypoxic patient, what should their haemoglobin be?
The study wasn't really designed to look at that question. We were really testing whether, is there an effect modification or not. With some of the other work that we've planned to do once we go through this in a bit more detail, and we get some more granular data, perhaps we'll be able to start looking at that sort of question. But no, the work wasn't designed to answer that question.
Professor Dean again.
So I guess you can only do with or analyse the data that's in the database, but if you had the option of asking for one extra bit of data, what would that have been? If you,
I would have wanted SaO2, so I could calculate arterial oxygen content and put that in. And so you see that's one of the things that I've listed there. That's something that we plan to do with a nested cohort. Yeah.
Peter Kruger. Leaving out the ventilated, non-ventilated patients, and do you think it's worth looking? You got any thoughts on whether the similar thing might apply to people who aren't ventilated rather than mechanically ventilated only?
I suspect that it probably will. The reason we chose mechanically ventilated patients, two reasons. One, we wanted the sicker patients with a higher baseline mortality, hopefully. And secondly, a lot of the previous work that's been done in this field in intensive care has used mechanically ventilated patients, so that's why we stuck to that. But yes, I think there probably will be a similar relationship.
Still 2 minutes.
Can I just have a quick indication how much of that is your own work? Thanks.
Yep. So Nick Fisher helped me at the Datathon with basically getting the data out of the database. And he did a lot of the original sort of, data manipulations and those sort of things. The statistical analysis had to be completely reworked after our initial work, so I did all of that stuff. So the analysis that I've presented here is essentially all my work.
Thank you.
Here's one.
Just looking at the hypoxemic patients, is the most pressing thing to treat the haemoglobin or to perhaps adjust the oxygenation at that stage?
So I was wondering that looking at the first graph that I pulled up, the problem is that this data doesn't really help you answer that question. What this data shows you is some associations. It doesn't really give you any sort of information on what would happen if you moved someone from one PO2 decile to the next. I don't think you can make that leap, though tempting it is to do.